Haven't seen it yet. Today, President Cyril Ramaphosa has unveiled a Nelson Mandela statue, life-size, at the United Nations in New York. Ramaphosa is leading a South African delegation to this year's UN General Assembly. It's his first visit to the world body as head of state. He's expected to outline South Africa's domestic and foreign policy objectives, including the land reform program and economic challenges. Unveiling the statue gifted to the UN inside the building, Ramaphosa told his audience that the values by which Nelson Mandela lived and dedicated his life to are universal.
We trust that his image and this statue will remain a constant reminder to the international community of the dedication of Nelson Mandela to the mission of the United Nations, and will be a constant affirmation of South Africa's commitment to continue to contribute to a better world for all.
Nelson Mandela embodied the highest values of the United Nations: peace, forgiveness, compassion, and human dignity. He was a champion for all people, in his words and in his actions. He was willing to fight and die for the ideals he held so dear. When he achieved the pinnacle of power as president of his beloved country, Madiba set an example that will resound throughout Africa and the world. He stepped down after one term, confident in the durability of South Africa's newfound democracy. He did not pursue power for its own sake, but simply as a means of service. This humility is a hallmark of Madiba's greatness.
So President Cyril Ramaphosa has given the opening address at the day-long Nelson Mandela Peace Summit at the UN in New York. This event seeks to use Madiba's legacy and life example to inspire the global organization on the question of peace and security. Ramaphosa says in responding to the threats of current conflicts in the world, the UN needs to be responsive, adaptable, and able to deal with challenges its founders could not have even imagined. The South African president has challenged world leaders to play their part in ensuring that the UN is more responsive to those global challenges. Ramaphosa says that world leaders can no longer ignore challenges such as terrorism, transnational organized crime, illicit flows of finance, and the growing number of refugees. All right, let's get more. Our own Sherwin Bryce Pease has been at the UN today, even hosting a session, Sherwin, with Graça Machel and Kumi Naidu. Firstly, I want to start with the statue. You got up close and personal with it. What's it like?
Well, there was a great deal of enthusiasm around that statue, particularly when President Ramaphosa arrived. In fact, Sherwin, the journalist, was bellowing at diplomats to get out of the way because they were ruining our shot, Francis, something you might have done as well. You know, at the end of the day, if we don't get the picture, we don't get the story. So a great deal of enthusiasm, certainly, and a few doors away, President Donald Trump was also in the building hosting an initiative on drug policy, which none of the people at the statue were very much interested in at the time. So really a great deal of enthusiasm, although some wonderment on some of the faces as to whether the statue actually represents the former president of South Africa. That's a debate I will leave to the people watching at home.
The UN gets lots of gifts. I mean, there's statues all over the place and carpets and things, but there's a lot of negotiation behind the scenes as to where it goes. Give us a little bit of insight into all of the machinations behind.
Actually, no statues, Francis. This is actually the first statue donated to the United Nations. There are some busts, and initially the negotiations were about a Madiba bust to be donated on this day. And of course, when Ambassador Jerry Machila took over from Kingsley Mamabolo, this evolved into a statue. Natim Tetwa, the Arts and Culture Minister, was here earlier this year to really negotiate how this transfer, this gift was going to happen. Of course, the choreography all happens before beforehand. It's like a summit anywhere. You have the Sherpas that go and hammer out the communique that political leaders arrive and adopt, in front of the camera. So it was a bit of that, a lot of behind-the-scenes negotiation. There was some controversy about where the statue would be placed. Initially, there was an agreement, according certainly to the South Africans, that it would stand alone at a curved wall. And if you look at the pictures that we've sent you, there is now not a tapestry, but a mural behind the statue where it was unveiled today. This is a mural donated by the Mexican government, and there was some confusion as to why the two works of art were now going to be positioned at the same spot in the United Nations. So there was a compromise from the South Africans. The statue is now going to be moved to the Visitors Center. So essentially, where the majority of people who come through the doors at the United Nations enter, that is where they will now be greeted by the outstretched arms of South Africa's first democratically elected president. So a little controversy around there, but at the end of the day, the sentiment, I think, and the legacy of Mandela certainly prevailed in terms of finding a peaceful solution to that conflict.
And a prominent place. So then the Mandela Peace Summit kicked off. And tell me if you agree, Sherwin, but it felt like a lot of South Africans or people linked to this country are really prominent there and maybe asserting that we, again, can contribute to the world.
Well, this should not be lost on anyone. The reason that this Mandela Peace Summit, and as part of the centenary of Nelson Mandela's birth, is really to have the wind at South Africa's backs as they enter the UN Security Council next year. South Africa will start observing the processes in the Security Council from next month, October, so that when they take their seat on the 1st of January, they are able and ready to deal with a number of issues, 70% of which relate to the African continent. Of course, the DRC elections in December, and I think around the 23rd of December, just before Christmas. A great deal of international diplomacy underway, a great deal of concern that things could unravel in that country. So certainly atop the South African agenda from an African perspective as they enter the council. But you're absolutely correct. This is Heritage Day in South Africa, the heritage that Nelson Mandela has left us, the legacy, his legacy of peace, his legacy of respect for humanity and reconciliation are trademarks that the South Africans hope to take into the council with them and to inspire some of the intransigence that we witness in the Security Council. You know, one of the speakers at the Mandela Peace Summit, in addition to President Ramaphosa and the Secretary General, in the opening plenary was the Amnesty International Secretary General Kumi Naidoo. And Kumi, in a very fiery speech, I'm sure you saw it, called on the P3 of the United States, China and Russia to join, he called them out by name, to join the International Criminal Court. And I think, this is kind of some of the example that the South Africans are hoping. The example of Nelson Mandela will rub onto some of the intractable situations we find ourselves dealing with in the Security Council today.
He also spoke about US President Donald Trump not accepting climate change, looking at what's happening in the Middle East. And I understand, Sherwin, that there is actually some sort of political declaration from this summit, but how strong will it be on those sorts of issues?
Well, it's a political declaration and not a resolution. And as you know, the only legal document here at the United Nations is a resolution that is passed by the UN Security Council. Resolutions passed by the UN General Assembly are not legally binding. They have moral weight. They have symbolic weight. And this was a mere political declaration. It says all the right things. It's quite a long document. But there are two things it doesn't say, Francis. It doesn't call for reform, and it doesn't mention the word Security Council in it. And when we talk about peace in the world, how do you exclude the organ at the United Nations that is tasked with maintaining peace and security around the world? And so in our discussion with Graça Machel, there was a great deal of concern around the fact that the Security Council is not mentioned in this document. But if you talk to the South Africans, they will tell you that they wanted to reach consensus. They wanted to reach consensus quickly. And the easiest way to do that was to not inject controversial issues into this debate. It's a debate, certainly, for intergovernmental negotiations that you well know have been going on since 2007, a process that has lasted almost a quarter of a century, and we are no closer to seeing the reforms that Africans in particular seek 2 African permanent seats with the veto, in addition to 5 non-permanent seats for Africa in terms of the Ezulwini consensus that was adopted in Swaziland a few years ago. We're no closer to that. So, 2 issues that are not in the political declaration, South Africans can decide whether that will have a fundamental impact or not.
All right, well, thank you for that update, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, and he's on top of everything happening at the UN this week. All right, we take a short break. We'll be back with more news.